Africa is on the front line of the climate emergency. Africa is highly exposed to climate shocks, which are affecting millions of people across the continent.
Aujourd'hui, le continent est traversé par une alternance de sécheresse et d'inondations qui se suivent. Une perturbation des cycles agricoles, une avancée du désert.
So our continent is affected.
These shocks are being compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the food and fiscal crisis.
For Africa, adaptation to climate change is not just important, but it is also a survival strategy.
Now is not the time to neglect climate action. Africa must harness climate resilient solutions quickly and at scale.
The African Development Bank and the Global Center on Adaptation launched the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, which we call AAP, to mobilize $25 billion for climate adaptation in Africa by 2025.
Through the AAP, we are scaling up access to climate-smart digital technologies for farmers in Africa, integrating climate risks and resilience into infrastructure investments, supporting job creation through entrepreneurship in adaptation and resilience, and increasing finance flows for adaptation and resilience to the continent. Adaptation holds transformational potential for the African continent, with swift and bold action across all sectors. Africa can move forward rapidly on a resilient and green growth pathway, harnessing powerful synergies between adaptation, growth, and development.
The climate emergency has Africa at the crossroads. Business as usual is a surefire route to chaos, but adapt to it and Africa will thrive. What is good for Africa is good for the world. And this has never been more true with the climate crisis. Excellencies, friends, my name is Patrick Verkooyen. I'm the CEO of the Global Center on Adaptation. Welcome. I think if you're here today, it is because you know Africa is unstoppable. We all believe in it. But as Kristalina reminded me yesterday, Africa is also at the crossroads. And as Amina reminded me yesterday, the international community itself is at a crossroads too. Because if COP27 fails, all the gains of Glasgow, ALOC, will have been squandered. Global climate cooperation will suffer a massive setback that nobody can afford. An African COP on African soil, as Africa is the world's most vulnerable continent. And following an extraordinary summer, we should have shivers thinking, what happens if Africa's great rivers suddenly dry up or go riot? We know, of course, that 1/3 of Pakistan is underwater today. And in Jackson, Mississippi, very recently, 1 million water bottles have been handed out. This is the climate crisis in action. But in Africa, climate shocks are going to hit home even harder. And we must be ready for it. But as you said, President Macky Sall, Africa itself will not stop. It has awoken. It is the engine of the world economy. But it won't continue unless Africa adapts. All of us, everywhere, would feel the fallout of Africa not adapting. It cannot be contained. But we don't have to go there. This year, I have been extremely inspired by my travels in Africa. I was in Kenya, I was in DRC with you, President Tshisekedi. I was in Ghana visiting you, President Akufo-Addo. And only a few days ago, I was with you, President Macky Sall, in Senegal. I've seen firsthand Africans taking adaptation action. I've seen the resilience of the people. Africa is standing up, and its adaptation solutions are ready to be scaled up. The next summit after today is Sharm el-Sheikh. But success in Egypt will hinge on whether Africa's needs are met or not. And adaptation action in Africa needs to be front, it needs to be center. Fortunately, Africa has the commitment. Fortunately, Africa has the plan. We just saw in the video the AAAP, the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. It's Africa developed, it's Africa owned. It was launched by Africa's leaders, and Africa's leaders are here with us again today. They remind us that the AAAP is Africa's flagship venture, and that it is the vehicle for delivering the Africa Adaptation Initiative. The program, it has the scale, the program has the ambition to deliver what Africa and the African Union expects in terms of adaptation support. No other African adaptation projects comes close in terms of ambition. What is it? A $25 billion over 5 years program. Is that too ambitious? No. Africa's adaptation finance gap is $41 billion a year. AAAP is therefore about turning the tide on resilience in Africa. And what is more, the AAAP already has the track record to deliver. Since launching last year, more than $3 billion of investments on the ground for people in Africa have become reality. And half of the needed funds, $12.5 billion, are already there. The other half, though, another $12.5 billion, remains to be mobilized. We have to double down on adaptation this year.
The world has a fever called climate change. We are all suffering. But the science and statistics tell us that Africa is where the fever is at its most intense, where people are at their most vulnerable. Africans make up nearly a fifth of the world's population, yet they contribute almost nothing to global warming. Africa is responsible for less than 3% of the world's total greenhouse gas emissions. Out of the world's 10 countries most vulnerable to climate change, 9 of them are in African continent. We have a moral duty to nurse the planet back to health, but we also have the common sense to know that unless we heal the patient, we will all suffer the consequences. We will all live or we will all die if we do not take action now. It's not all gloom. The good news is that we have a start. We have a roadmap. Let me take you back to January 2021, last year, where this begins. It starts with the launch of the African Adaptation Acceleration Program. We call it the AAA for short. A few months later, GCA and African Development Bank with the African Union and the Africa Adaptation Initiative convened the largest meeting ever of African and global leaders on climate change, and the AAA was endorsed by all of them, yourselves. From there, we moved to Glasgow for COP26. It was in Glasgow that the world agreed to deliver on the Paris Agreement by committing to doubling adaptation financing. This firm commitment now sees to turn into urgent action. The AAA is Africa's plan for how to respond to the climate crisis by mobilizing $25 billion for adaptation in the areas of food security, resilient infrastructure, climate finance, and youth employment. The AAA is working through two mechanisms. It has the upstream financing facility, which GCA hosts, which is mobilizing $255 million over 5 years to help African countries access the best knowledge, science, and solutions. And the second mechanism is the climate window, which is part of the African Development Bank under the leadership of President Adesina. Since Glasgow, we are moving into higher gears. We at GCA are working together with our partners, with the AFDB, the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, with African institutions, with governments and civil society, with the private sector, and with the youth constituencies. We have, under the impressive leadership of CEO Patrick Verkooyen, already influenced $3 billion of investments through the upstream financing facility. $1 invested in the facility leads to $100, 100 times influenced to bring the best adaptation solutions to Africa. But the upstream financing facility can do so much more. Its potential is huge. With this leverage ratio of 1 to 100, this is truly a winning investment. And it is for this reason that I am calling upon all our development partners to engage with us and to contribute and to deliver on the Glasgow Pledge to double adaptation finance.
Africa is facing three major challenges, which are called the 3 Cs: COVID, climate, and conflict. The solution to the 3 Cs is the same: 3 Fs: finance, finance, and finance. Africa was still dealing with the financing recovery from COVID when conflict broke out as Russia invaded Ukraine, triggering soaring food prices and inflation. To forestall potential food crisis in Africa from Russia's war in Ukraine, the African Development Bank announced on May 29th a $1.5 billion Africa Emergency Food Production Facility. The facility, to support 20 million farmers, will provide access to climate-resilient seeds for maize, for wheat, for rice, and soybeans, and support the production of 38 million metric tons of food valued at $12 billion. The approvals on the facility have been incredibly fast. Within 60 days, the bank has approved $1.13 billion for operations in 24 countries, and we expect to reach 35 countries at the end of this month. Your Excellencies, Africa now needs a lot of financing to tackle climate change, as you have heard. The continent is warming up faster than any region of the world, as predictions from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change show that the critical global warming levels will be reached much earlier in Africa. The effects will be devastating: loss of crops, decimation of livestock populations, and livelihoods of pastoralists, while child wasting will increase by 37% in West Africa and 25% in East Africa. A 1-degree increase in temperature is also going to be associated with 11% greater risk of conflict in Africa, as it triggers weather-related disasters and conflicts, with already 4.3 million Africans already displaced due to climate change. Your Excellencies, the African Development Fund's 16th replenishment now presents such a wonderful opportunity we must not miss. Never have the stakes been so high for Africa's low-income and fragile states that depend on the ADF. 9 out of the 10 countries most vulnerable to climate change in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa, and all of them, 100%, are all ADF countries. Yet the ADF countries do not have access to global finance on climate. To change this, the ADF has introduced what we call the Climate Action Window. This window is hoping to mobilize between $4 billion to $13 billion for climate adaptation for these ADF highly vulnerable countries. What will it do? It will be used to support 20 million farmers with access to climate-resilient agricultural technologies. Another 20 million farmers to get access, including pastoralists, to weather-indexed crop insurance, reviving 1 million hectares of degraded land and providing access for about 9.65 million people in terms of renewable energy. That's the scale of action that we are going to be forcing and driving. Commitments made by developed countries to provide $100 billion annually in climate finance for developing countries are long overdue. Your Excellencies, Africa can no longer wait. This is the time to support the African Adaptation Acceleration Program with the money that it needs. This is the time to support as well the African Development Fund's 16th replenishment. This is the time to support the climate action window of the ADF 16th replenishment. Your Excellencies, present here today are action shapers, from heads of state and government to the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, the African Union Commission's chairperson, the Vice President of the European Union Commission, development ministers to heads of global financial institutions, from the head of IMF, the head of WTO, bilateral agencies, multilateral development banks, and many more. If there was ever a group that can shape success and deliver climate adaptation for Africa, it is the leaders in this room today. You are the doers, and that's why you are here. So let's rise and deliver for Africa. Let's secure our common future. Let's put up the resources for climate adaptation in Africa. The past got us to where we are now. Now let us create a new path, a new future, our common future, where every African can thrive in a climate-secure world.
So let us now turn to the heads of state, to the heads of government from Africa, being here in the Netherlands, being here in Rotterdam. And I have an extraordinary honor to introduce a person who is not only the head of state, but is also chairing the African continent for the year, who is a man who is extremely bold and very executive. And I'm sure, President Macky Sall, you have very clear expectations as well from this meeting. We're all very keen to hear it.
This is 2 months from the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. I wish to greet the leaders of the multilateral institutions who are here present, the multilateral development banks and the European Investment Bank. I also like to greet all the leaders present here in this room. But I cannot help but note, with some bitterness, the absence of leaders from the industrial world. I think if we made the effort to leave Africa to come to Rotterdam, it would be easier for the Europeans and others to be here, because they are the main polluters on this planet, and they are the ones who should be financing adaptation. If they are absent in this room, as we can see, if the private sector is also absent and is one of the main polluters, this gives us an incomplete taste in our mouths. I have to say this honestly. I am a bit disappointed. Africa is a continent that is vulnerable to climate change, and we are behind on our processes of adaptation. Africa benefits from very little financing and investment for adaptation, despite dedicated mechanisms being in place. However, even if so Africa pollutes the least, it is the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. We are fully engaged in resilience and the preservation of our ecosystems and our natural habitats, which offers humanity so much. So more than a decade ago, well before the Paris Climate Agreement, we have been developing major projects, notably that of the Great Green Wall, which unites 11 African countries in the Sahel region. I will remind you that this Great Green Wall project has an priority investment plan for over 10 years, from 2021 to 2030, of $18 billion, which aims to support local reforestation initiatives, land reclamation, and agriculture and pastoral activities that can generate revenue. So, in terms of those efforts, we aim to protect 500 million hectares of forest and 500,000 hectares of plantations, and reduce the vulnerable areas, the areas that are vulnerable to wildfires, by 90%. Senegal is also amongst the pioneers of the implementation of the Green Wall, and we paid a voluntary contribution of over $800 million to the Pan-African Organization for the Great Green Wall, apart from its statutory commitments. It is just a way for us to show the high priority we give to this continental initiative, which is built on a vision that is both ecological, climate-centered, and humanistic, centered on people. The Great Green Wall project aims to act as a lever in the fight against desertification. All of these efforts have enabled us to make the Great Green Wall project more visible and have raised commitments of $20 million, which we are still waiting to see. What will make the difference is the real mobilization of these resources in support of concrete projects on the ground closest to the vulnerable populations. The financial commitments from the Paris Agreement on climate and the various announcements, numerous announcements towards climate and economic resilience and making are a bit late already. What about the $100 billion per year for developing countries? This is a commitment that should have been in place since 2020. This commitment is not a favor to developing countries. I have to remind you of this. This is about implementing the principle, the agreed principle of joint but differentiated responsibility as part of the common efforts of all countries to save our planet Earth, our common habitat. This reflects a just and equitable solution. When countries of Africa are asked to renounce on polluting development to deal with the current state of emergency on the planet, it is only fair that, as a counterpart, the cost of adaptation to this should be shared equitably also. This is the essence of our advocacy. Notably, a financial commitment of $100 billion per year from 2020 to 2030, the affectation to Africa of a part of the green bonds and other innovating investment mechanisms, and simplifying access to climate funding and making that access more transparent as well.
Excellencies, we're aware of the current geopolitical circumstances. Food and energy security are at risk across the world. Inflation is rapidly rising, and the climate change threatens the progress we have made, especially in Africa. COVID-19, which resulted in sub-Saharan's first recession in some 25 years, is still hurting Africa. Some 26 million people fell into extreme poverty, and 30 million jobs were lost due to the repercussions of the pandemic in Africa. My country, Ghana, is attempting to use her own fiscal resources to address these risks. The same is true for other African countries. However, the growing food and fuel crises, are limiting severely our fiscal space to respond effectively as the cost of borrowing goes up prohibitively and access to the capital market tightens dramatically. Africa contributes the least to the climate emergency, responsible for less than 4% of global emissions. Yet we are facing increasing and more intense climate-related extreme events. We are indeed at a crossroads. If we want our continent to thrive, we have to adapt to climate change. And to achieve this, adaptation financing needs to start flowing at scale. Climate action must not become another casualty of the complex geopolitical era that we are experiencing. Last year's COP26 in Glasgow was a great moment of hope, with its pledge to double global climate adaptation finance by 2025. With the implementation COP ahead of us in just a few weeks in Sharm el-Sheikh, in the Arab Republic of Egypt, now is the moment of truth. It is time to turn words into deeds and ambition into action. With the world in flames and under floodwaters, the eyes of people everywhere will be on the decision makers at COP27. They have to deliver if they are to escape the censure of history. Excellencies, I want to thank Professor Patrick Vercoyen, CEO of the GCA, for his tireless leadership in mobilizing the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, AAAP, together with Dr. Adesina, the dynamic president of the African Development Bank. The AAAP, with its laser focus on food security, resilient infrastructure, climate finance, and youth employment, is Africa's solution to the multiple crises we face. The program intends to mobilize some $25 billion over 5 years to scale up and accelerate adaptation action. The African Development Bank has, in a truly laudable gesture, committed to providing half of the amount. This is evidence that Africa has the leadership and determination to engage in solutions to her own problems. But Africa needs its friends from across the world also to scale up their support for concrete adaptation solutions delivered through the AAAP. We expect these friends to manifest their solidarity and friendship by delivering the other half, just as we believe that time is long overdue for the developed countries to make good on their annual $100 billion pledge for climate adaptation. As chair of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, Ghana will also push COP27 to deliver on the commitment to doubling adaptation finance alongside other priorities. Financing climate adaptation makes economic sense. It is much more cost-effective than paying the bills every time they're due for increasingly frequent and severe climate shocks and disasters. As a middle-income country, Ghana stands to lose out of the effects of more acute and frequent climate hazards. Thankfully, through the AAAP, we're making progress in addressing the climate emergency. The Ghana Roadmap for Climate Resilient Infrastructure, which was launched earlier this year, provides an investment blueprint for adaptation in Ghana, highlighting in stark terms the cost of inaction.
In Ethiopia, we're witnessing a huge transformation in wheat production in irrigated perimeters due to access to farmers to wheat-tolerant wheat varieties with the support of the African Development Bank. The bank's technologies for African agricultural transformation has been providing Ethiopian farmers with those seeds. The cultivated area under these heat-tolerant wheat varieties increased from 5,000 hectares in 2019 to reach 655 hectares now. This will definitely allow Ethiopia to be self-sufficient in wheat production. We have not imported wheat this year, And the plan is to become, of course, a net exporter of wheat. The Green Legacy Initiative in Ethiopia, by promoting green culture, aims to significantly decarbonize the economy of the country while improving livelihoods and socio-economic development of citizens. Over 20 million citizens are involved in regreening Ethiopia every year. This initiative has motivated the establishment of several thousands of nurseries that are able to raise billions of seedlings every year. The lesson is clear. We must do all to scale up access of farmers in Africa to climate-resilient agricultural technologies. I wish to commend the Global Center on Adaptation and the African Development Bank for their bold action plan, the African Adaptation Acceleration Program, which has set a goal of mobilizing $25 billion for climate adaptation in Africa. We should all support this effort. I wish the presidential dialogue between African heads of states and government and other global leaders had taken place in order to accelerate progress in mobilizing support and resources for the AAAP. I join leaders who have spoken before me in deploring their absence. And in fact, to be a bit bold, sometimes we should not appear to be talking to each other while those who should be with us are not present. This program is a game changer for Africa, the AAAP on climate adaptation. I call on all the development partners to fund this program. By doing so, we will assure that Africa can build climate resilience. We call for a substantive 16th replenishment of the African Development Fund, and especially to boost its capacity to deliver climate actions at scale through its climate action window. We need ADF to climate-proof Africa. Let's make the slogan, "Together we will build a more climate-resilient Africa," a reality.
Indeed. The Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program was indeed conceptualized by many of you here around the table, but there was one person who was there from the beginning. There was one person who has coordinated all partners on the continent to come forward in a united way. It's a very important chairperson of a very important institution. He's also a member of the board of the Global Center on Adaptation. Chairperson.
Africa is only responsible for 3% of global deterioration. We note that the continent took the option to contribute to the world solution through national efforts, through adaptation plans that are often supported by budgetary grants. I will remind you that Africa contributes 2.5 to 3% of its GDP to adaptation to climate change. Our third thing that we note is the incongruous part of the low part played by investments in Africa in adaptation to climate. There is a strong imbalance between Africa's responsibility and the volume of resources that it receives. This is where one of the most shocking injustices towards our continent resides. This is all the more striking when we know that Africa has given itself a solid judicial arsenal to play its part in adaptation to climate change. Beyond the stated political will, we have put in place a number of structures, including committees of heads of state and government on climate change. The Union African's action plan and strategy on climate change and resilient development, which is the continent's policy in terms of climate change. This strategy covers the full spectrum of adaptation and low-carbon development. To crown this effort, the African Union last July adopted the joint African position on access to energy and a fair transition. The second point I would like to raise concerns the lack of a rapid response to African requests. We have to say that we can't talk about reaching net zero when around 54% of the African population of about 1.3 billion people is still deprived of electricity. They don't even know electricity. While developed countries have helped themselves to fossil fuels before beginning to question this process and turning towards the energy transition. Africa has a strong gas resources. Is this African exceptionalism? We should start by keeping to the United Nations Convention on Climate Change with joint responsibility, joint but differentiated responsibility. If we do not act, climate change will have dramatic effects across our continent. We are already living through this. In the Sahel, in the Lake Chad Basin, in the Horn of Africa, El Nino effects on the east and the south of the continent show this. The third remark I would like to make is about financing. This is where it really hurts. The goal for climate financing in Africa is far from what was committed. And of those funds, only 21% are allocated for adaptation. Often large sums were announced, but they never materialized. Obviously, we congratulate the Glasgow COP for committing to double this sum by 2025. At the Sharm el-Sheikh COP27, we hope that these commitments will be met.
I would like personally to thank the heads of state and government and our institutional leaders who are present here today. As an African citizen, I can tell you, and as an international leader, it's not because we don't have anything else to do back at home. This is an important meeting. The issues we are discussing today are an existential threat to every single one of us, the 8 billion on God's earth. I do also join in the regrets that key decision makers are not at this meeting. The number of people around this table, it is lopsided. A bird only flies on two wings. We need genuine partnerships, and they need to be at the table. So I hope those representing them will take those messages home, because we still have 4 important meetings before we get to COP. I would say with the response to COVID, as the Secretary General has said, the response to climate change and the response to the impacts of the war in the rest of the world in Ukraine, we've probably gone past the time we call for solidarity, because we have been calling for it for many years. We're also almost past the time of the promise to humankind while protecting our planet. And I would say what is now at risk is that you add another debt to Africa and SIDS, one of solidarity and one of the broken promises. Let me express my solidarity with the people of Pakistan who are facing the latest of the worst catastrophes that we have seen from climate. But Excellencies, friends, ladies and gentlemen, 4 African presidents, the President of the African Development Bank, our Chair of the African Union Commission, have spoken on behalf of Africa. And I'm going to set aside my speech and just say 2-3 things, because I would only reiterate and amplify their calls. This is a table of doers. We've heard everything from the science, from the crises, from the transformations that we need, including that it is of no fault of Africa that we are in this position. And one wonders what would happen if the roles were reversed. Missing right in the conversations we're having right now is the urgency and scale for the investments that are needed by developed countries for the commitments to keep the 1.5-degree promise and to keep the Paris Agreement. Africa has provided a litany of things that are needed, pipelines of projects, evidence of ability to do these things on the continent, and money spent. It is calling for transitions in food systems, in energy, in the digital world that we all have a right to have today, and yet we are still behind. On our way to COP27, the Africa COP, the implementation COP, the adaptation COP, the partnership COP, the COP that really should say to the rest of the world as we come to COP28 and the stocktake, we're back on track. We've recovered. It's 3 months away. Sadly, today, we're seeing ourselves walk back on our promises, because no matter what we do, that 1 + 1 is not making 2, it's making 6, it's making 7. There's different definitions of what progress means. And I'm one of those that believe in keeping hope alive, so I don't mind shifting what it is we're doing so it gives us a little bit more hope for tomorrow. But what is clear is the Glasgow Pact, which was negotiated very carefully by Alok with a huge amount of dexterity, is at risk of failing, as is the 100 billion, which, by the way, is a handshake. It's not the money we need for climate action. It's a handshake of what it means to have a genuine partnership on issues that Africa has and the SIDS have had no part in playing. Adaptation funds down. The 130 trillion, which was taken as a promise of Glasgow, of what could be available. The mitigation, we're seeing more emissions today than we ever had, and they're rising. Yet, even as we witness heat waves in Europe, in the Horn of Africa, Pakistan's latest catastrophe, I'm not sure what it is that will convince us to move the next pace forward. The plea, the clarion call, the ask, the challenge that in the UN General Assembly, in less than 10 days' time, in the annual meetings, in the G20 that's hanging by a thread as well, that we come with the tools that will unlock the resources we know are there, the financing that is needed by COP27. And we know it's possible. Why? Because the leadership of Kristalina Georgieva has proved it. She's brought to the table innovative mechanisms like the RST, with countries already applying for it, to fruition. By October, we'll be in business. It's possible because if we replenish the ADF, what already Akin has shown us can go to scale. It's possible because that 100 billion is almost there. So we need the signals that Glasgow meant something, that Paris is alive, that hope is alive, that 1.5 degrees is no longer hanging by a thread, that the evidence and the science, most importantly, the lives that have been lost, the livelihoods and the property that has been lost in Africa, really does demonstrate the reality for over 1 billion people in jeopardy. So let's use this moment for a reset, for Africa and for the world and for our future generations. Thank you.
I recognize there is disappointment of who is not here, but let's rejoice of those who are here and what you do where you're leading the continent. Like Amina, I'm setting aside my prepared remarks. I want to reflect on what I heard from all of you and talk about three things. One, the context in which we meet. Second, the criticality to adopt the concept of resilience and for Africa to accelerate adaptation. And third, the role of my institution, the IMF, and how we partner with others. The context in which we meet. Last year we were here and we were hopeful that the COVID-induced economic crisis is behind us and that 2022 would be a prosperous year. Unfortunately, we were proven wrong. A crisis upon a crisis. We now are experiencing a cost of living crisis, a war in Europe, the invasion of Ukraine that has gotten an impact fast and far, and a climate crisis that this year, if anyone was still in the belief that somehow we will duck and it will pass over our heads, now we know it is dramatic and it is to be even more serious in the future. there are two lessons we draw from the context today. One, that we are living in a more shock-prone world, that we have to be mindful that we cannot anymore project the future, plan for it, and run our models, because unexpected events would disrupt this planning. And second, we learned that our global cooperation is more fragile, that the risk of fragmentation is serious. And at the time we need each other more than ever, it is harder to come together for collective action. And yet we must. So Amina's call on us to embrace that hope of humanity coming together in the most testing moments. This is what I do from my heart of heart endorse. We are also recognizing that these shocks have exhausted our people. People are tired of the pandemic, and now they're hit a second time with inflation. In many countries, the fiscal space is gone. When you look at the debt situation for 25% of emerging markets, that is no more sustainable. Just think of Sri Lanka and many countries that are in this position. Actually, we see a country, a strong economy with strong fundamentals like Ghana, in a situation in which it is harder to tap into markets because of these exogenous shocks. And for poor countries, it is over 60% that are in debt distress. So when I look at this picture, what is the conclusion? No more we can think of our economies as relatively simple mechanisms in which, as long as we have the banking sector and financial stability, they function. Remember, after the 2009 crisis, we did something very wise. We regulated the banking sector. It is now more resilient. But that concept of resilience has to expand to be a comprehensive one. We need resilient people that are educated, that are healthy, and have sound social protection under their feet. We need not just resilient economies, we need resilient societies in which people feel that they belong, that there is fairness, that there are jobs for them. And we need our resilient planet.
When climate changes causes water levels to rise, this office will simply rise too. Designed for the future. A small but significant example of adaptation. And let this place serve as inspiration today as we discuss climate adaptation in Africa. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change recognizes Africa as the most vulnerable region on the planet when it comes to climate change impact. Africa has only one choice, and that is to adapt to climate change. I admire Africa's strong and ambitious response, supported by the GCA through the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. The challenge now is to put it into practice. Today's summit is an essential stepping stone towards an ambitious adaptation outcome for Africa at COP27 in Egypt later this year. Bearing in mind, as said by Ms. Georgieva, that representatives of other groups not present today have to get involved before COP27. As a Delta country that is equally vulnerable to climate change, the Netherlands stand by your side. we share the urgency to accelerate adaptation action, here in the Netherlands as well, as a quarter of our country lies below sea level. 2/3 is vulnerable to flooding. And in these areas, we generate 70% of our GDP. For many decades and centuries, we fought to keep the water out. But today, we find ourselves struggling with a lack of water. Drought is a serious problem to which we desperately need to adapt. This summer, water levels in the Rhine dropped to their lowest ever, with serious consequences for shipping, nature, and water supply. So we too need expertise on retaining, storing, and distributing water, as well as getting rid of it as quickly as possible in some times. There's a lot of knowledge we can and want to share, but we also have a lot to learn. The Netherlands is strongly committed to promoting adaptation action, not only at home, in Europe and across the world, but certainly in Africa. Like in South Africa, where we're working on water management as part of the Blue Deal program. Or in Ghana, where we're helping to stress test the infrastructure. Or in Mozambique with the Partners for Water program. But we need far more action on a much larger scale to close the adaptation action gap for the most climate vulnerable around the world.
If there ever was a time to drastically raise food production in Africa, it is now. And I see small-scale producers, food producers, as the backbone of our food systems. And I believe in their ability to work the land, work the resources in a sustainable way, providing enough food for a growing population and for local and regional markets. And let me emphasize the role of women and girls in our efforts. They play a special role in that respect. Women are food producers, they are traders, consumers, decision makers, negotiators, and in many households, food insecurity and poverty prevail when the women are hurt. It must be mentioned also today. The world must stand by our commitments and scale up climate finance and our investments in food production and resilience. I assure you that Norway is committed. Norway will double our climate finance, and I emphasize that we will at least triple the support to adaptation by 2026. And we are delivering on our Glasgow commitments, and we call upon everyone to do the same.
Many countries feel the effects of climate change, but no place feels the consequences more than Africa. Those with the fewest resources to adapt are the hardest hit. Denmark has set a clear goal. 60% of our climate aid will help developing countries to adapt to climate change. We will also continue our strong support in the fight against climate-related loss and damage. And we will continue to mobilize climate finance, including private investments. In total, Denmark expects to give at least 1% of the collective target of $100 billion. I hope this can pave the way for massive investments in adaptation and green energy in Africa. And Denmark will continue to do our part.
I am happy to announce that France will bring 10 billion euros to the Adaptation Acceleration in Africa program over 2 years. France will be amongst the top donors for this initiative, and this commitment will enable us to prepare adaptation projects everywhere on Africa, on the African continent, and also to create a great leverage to ensure we will mobilize up to 1 billion euros. These efforts will also be practical. It will support projects created as regards within the scope of this initiative. indeed, for instance, as President Macron said, the farm initiative and also the Great Green Wall. And also, we are fully mobilized to ensure that we will fund the projects for the acceleration for adaptation in Africa.
Here's my commitment, Patrick. The commitment and the reason I'm so passionate is I feel trade is part of the solution. People often see trade as part of the problem, the logistics of trade as contributing to carbon emissions. Yes, and there are solutions that will come for that. But they don't think of trade as part of the solution. And what we are committing to do is to demonstrate how trade can be part of that solution and the things that we are going to commit to make sure that once we mobilize this money, we are not stopped from using it because of the wrong policies around trade. It's vital that we integrate trade policies into adaptation to help diversify economies, upgrade and develop new productive capacities. We need to build greater supply chain resilience. And this is where the WTO plays a role. We need to bring African countries from the margins of global supply chains to the mainstream. With stronger economies, the African continent will be more resilient and more able to adapt. Without trade, the continent will not be able to meet its development and poverty reduction goals, nor implement effective adaptation strategies. At COP27, along with climate finance issues, we need to give focus to trade and investment facilitation for the climate transformation and the just transformation that we need. The WTO can be helpful in bringing this about. Let me end by saying that the WTO is committed to working with all partners so that trade can do its part for climate action. We are particularly committed to working with partners to deliver for the continent. We'll work with the IMF, the OECD, we'll work with everyone, African Development Bank, the World Bank, and we are going to work with the GCA. Just this morning, we signed an MOU with Patrick to talk about how the GCA and the WTO can work together to try and deliver for Africa's adaptation needs. Our members are coming along, and I think from now ongoing, you will see action on the part of the World Trade Organization.
What separates us from those who are not here today, not because we're naive, not because we're optimists or pessimists, we're incredibly determined because adaptation action for Africa is unstoppable. I thank you very much indeed. Let's close this meeting, but let's continue working. My thank you.